Thanks for joining us here at the Commonwealth Club, and thank you to our audience live streaming this program and watching down the line through the miracle of the digital world. As Philip mentioned, my name is Ray Suarez, and I'm the host of our radio program On Shifting Ground. As a reminder, please silence your phones and submit any questions for our guests this evening via the question cards provided or the live chat if you're joining us online. You don't have to have the cards. You can still get in on the conversation. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Stuart Stevens, Senior Advisor to the Lincoln Project and author of the recent book, The Conspiracy to End America: 5 Ways My Old Party is Driving Our Democracy to Autocracy. Stevens is a former chief GOP strategist, so he has special insights into how candidates think and act on the campaign trail, especially during this part of the campaign season. He knows how the parties should be preparing for the final 90 days of the presidential race. Please join me in giving Stuart Stevens a warm welcome. Well, Stuart, is it fair to say that this is the weirdest July and August in your memory?
Well, you know, I keep thinking back to the summer that Nixon resigned. These kind of tumultuous events. A week in politics can be a long time. I think something very unusual is happening in American politics now. I think there's actually one movement meeting another movement more than 2 parties meeting. And I think it's the most positive development that we've had since election night when Biden won in 2020.
Was the Democratic Party sort of punting, improvising, scrambling, or were you impressed with the orderliness of the departure of Joe Biden and the arrival and the coalescing around Kamala Harris that happened quite quickly?
Yeah, you know, I wrote a piece for The Atlantic right after he announced that he was going to not take the nomination. He endorsed Harris. I wrote a piece that afternoon kind of like, how is this going to happen? And there are all these different scenarios, from the one of a broker convention, which I think, I mean, I love broker conventions to read about it. I love The Best Man by Gore Vidal. I love all that, but the actual reality of it, to try to put together a campaign August 22nd, it would have been a nightmare. And by far the most desirable was what has happened. And I think it's astounding the way it's happened. And I think it shows a real maturity on the part of the party, but part of that is the realization of the stakes. That if you really believe that democracy is in an existential threat, as I do, I think a lot of us do, it changes how you look at everything. It certainly changes the way that I look at, you know, a party I used to work against, the Democratic Party. I mean, I look back at the stuff we would argue about, like capital gains tax. Really? We argued, like, you know, really? That was such a big deal. It now seems very trivial. So I think the seriousness of the consequences seems to have impacted people. And you have a lot of selfless gestures here, I think, starting with the president, and then others who decided not to challenge her. Which, when you think about it, for a lot of these potential candidates out there that were named, if Vice President Harris wins, as I think she will, it's not crazy to think she's going to be president for 8 years. So if you're wanting to run for president, that's a serious decision you're making, that probably you won't be president in many cases. I think it's been extraordinarily positive.
You know, she wasn't on anybody's ballot anywhere in a caucus in the snows of Iowa, after town meetings in New Hampshire, nobody voted for Kamala Harris. Political parties make their own rules. They nominate their own candidates by their own rules. But immediately after this unusual series of events took place, there was carping from some quarters, satisfaction from other quarters, saying, look, this is too unusual. She was anointed, crowned. This wasn't regular order. Is that something that we're still going to be talking about 2 or 3 weeks from now, or is this the inevitable sort of post-game mumbling of sort?
Yeah, look, I think something kind of magical happens in that moment you give your acceptance speech. In a lot of cases, you walk on that stage one person, you walk off a different person. You're the nominee of a major party. And I think being vice president inevitably diminishes a vice president, and being a nominee enhances. So I think one of the exciting things about this moment is the good stuff hasn't happened yet. That's going to happen at the convention. And I think she'll give a great speech. I think President was going to give a great speech. I think the governor's going to give a great speech. And that is really when this race, I think, is going to start. And those post-Labor Day polls are very indicative for a reason. And I expect that they're going to be very favorable for the vice president.
Since the afternoon that Joe Biden made his decision public, Donald Trump, it seems apropos after the Olympics, has almost seemed like a wrestler looking for a hold, looking for a way to grasp his opponent. He's been, I guess it would be less charitable to call it flailing, but looking for lines of attack, both on the process, on the new nominee, and some of them have been just plain odd. Some of them have been predictable. Is it understandable, given the moment and given the particular personalities involved, that after spending the last 3 years running against him, he doesn't know how to run against her?
Yeah, no, I've never seen a campaign so visibly lost. There's a lot of remarkable things about it. Including the fact that they became the first political party in American history to have a convention attacking someone who's not a candidate. That's pretty remarkable. Trump is a candidate of anger or grievances of hate. There's really not a positive message that he has. For a lot of other candidates who had a different kind of message, I don't think it would have mattered as much. And I think that it just shows the thinness of any rationale for voting for Trump. He should still be able to articulate it. I'm not running because Joe Biden was president. I'm running because I want to do this. But they don't have an agenda. And that's one of the most striking things to me is, what is the bargain that Republican Party, and it goes beyond Trump, is trying to strike with voters? What do you get when you vote Republican now? I think they have this Project 2025 there, which they don't want to talk about because they're immensely unpopular. And then you compare that to the 100-day agenda that the president laid out, which I assume the vice president's going to more or less adopt. And the Project 2025, if you tested it, would test like 20 to 80 bad. The 100-day agenda is sort of 80-20 to the good. So in one very simple dynamic in this race, you take the 80-20 and you're running against the 20-80. And you ought to have a pretty good day at that. I think the Republican Party has declared war on the modern world. And there's so much about the modern world that is disturbing to them. So this is how they get in a fight with Nike over Colin Kaepernick. what happens? Nike makes $9 billion. They got in a fight with Disney. How do you get in a fight with the happiness company? I mean, just imagine. Remember at one point during COVID, they were in a fight with NASCAR because NASCAR banned the Confederate flag. So it's like, you're in a culture war with NASCAR and you're Republicans? And I think it goes to the root of what has happened to the Republican Party. It is overwhelmingly a white party. Trump's coalition was 85% white. In a country that's 59% white, less so since we've been talking. And while we talked about the inevitability of America becoming a majority-minority country, which is true, in some ways it already has happened. If you're 16 years and younger, the majority of Americans are non-white. And, the great failure of the Republican Party, and it was a failure when I was part of it in working campaigns, is our inability to particularly attract African Americans. At least, when I worked for Bush, we admitted this was a problem. Ken Mehlman, who was chairman of the party, went before the NAACP and apologized for the Southern strategy, that Nixon used to get Southern Democrats to become Republicans, which was very racially driven. So does that matter? I think it matters because the first step to trying to fix a problem is to realize you have a problem.
But is there an intersection between that anger and grievance that you describe and the inability to grasp the moment when the country is changing? When I first started covering politics, people who do the kind of job that you were doing in all those years used to tell me, optimism sells. Negative messages, especially in a national election, people don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear that the country's terrible, that everything's terrible. They want to hear that things are going to be better. Did the party change? Did its pitch to America change in a way that also dovetailed with who was a Republican? Because right now, they're not selling optimism and they're not selling sunniness. I'm sometimes aghast at a candidate for national office saying that it's like a third world country. I've spent a lot of time in third world countries. This is not like a third world country.
I find it just astounding. I think it's useful to look at the 80 race, Reagan against Carter. Okay, I think it's fair to say the country was kind of in a bad mood then. I mean, Carter himself said it, described it as a malaise. There was a hostage crisis. So Reagan was an optimistic alternative to that. I mean, Ronald Reagan announced in front of the Statue of Liberty as an ode to immigrants. The last speech he gave in office was a tribute to immigrants. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't dark sides to the Reagan campaign, and that's something I've grappled with and written about because I think, like a lot of Republicans, I denied it for too long. But usually the most optimistic candidate wins. I mean, in 2007, I don't think there were a lot of polls that showed hope and change was the number one issue in America. The Obama campaign came along. They ran a brilliant campaign. He was a once-in-a-generation candidate, and they made that happen. And I think that this moment that is being described as joy, which is really amazing to think about. In American politics, we're talking about a joyful moment, is so much more appealing than Trump. I mean, anger and hate is exhausting. And that has been the constant ethos of the Trump era. I mean, he's the only guy who got inaugurated for president in 2017 in a bad mood. I mean, what you think? Like, you got self-elected president that enjoy the afternoon, but he was upset about the crowds and gave this dystopian speech about carnage. I think it is very profound because it changes the way that you view yourself as an American. I mean, say what you will about Reagan. To be born in Ronald Reagan's view, to be born in America, you had won life's lottery. That there were inequality, certainly, but no one was disadvantaged in life because they had been born an American. That's not true in Trump's view. In Trump's view, we're suckers. There are these powerful forces out there that take advantage of us, like Canada. Remember, he declared Canada a national security threat. Like they're going to drive their snowmobiles over the line playing Celine Dion or something, I mean, really. And I think that is a very alien concept that most Americans feel to what it means to be an American.
So far, the writing about the Harris campaign, the still quite young Harris campaign, it's interesting to see the phrase again and again, she hasn't set a foot wrong. Eventually, she'll set a foot wrong. But right now, it's all going pretty well. And she has not spoken a lot to reporters. No long one-on-one interviews, no great big press avails, no big encounters with the gaggle. And they're starting to be grousing about that she's ducking the media, mostly from reporters who would like to talk to her. I'm not sure anybody else really cares, but they are the ones who convey what she has to say to the rest of us, so they end up being pretty important. If you were whispering in her ear, would you tell her to keep that going for a little while longer, at least till after the convention, or does she have to start talking more in unguarded, unscripted ways?
Well, I hope she never speaks in an unguarded way because that's the way candidates make mistakes. I would say stay the course till after the convention. And I would have a couple of big interviews set up after the convention and kind of break that ice. And look, there's always a push and pull. I mean, you know more about this than anybody. The push and pull between the campaign and the press. And, you know, there aren't a lot of long press conferences you come out a lot better off than when you went in. There's some, if you're clearing up like a scandal or something, where you're like John McCain answering questions about accusations of infidelity. He stood there till there were no more questions were being asked, and he probably made it go away because of that. But look, it's reporters are there, to make news, to have you say something you haven't said before. Otherwise, it's not news. So there's a natural tension there. But there was this sort of trope out there that Vice President Harris was not a good candidate. And, for a while, there was a lot of talk that one of the reasons people weren't going to vote for Biden is because something might happen to him and you would get Harris. And this was a big negative, particularly among a donor class. You heard a lot of that. And this was always a head scratcher to me. So, she defeated, you know this so much better than I. She defeated incumbent DA, never an easy thing to do. She did well enough that she wasn't challenged. She then won a very tough attorney general's race against the candidate who was the golden boy of Republican politics, not named Schwarzenegger. A popular Republican in Democratic LA County. He spent more money than she had. It's a race she should have won, but she won. Took a while, but she won it. Then she got herself elected to the U.S. Senate. Now she's vice president of the United States. So, how far could she have gone if she was a good candidate? It's like, I think it's a true statement. It must be that more.
Well, people are stuck on 2019 and early 2020 and her not making it to Iowa in the last go round. And I think there's been a tendency to treat her like a fly in amber, like someone who's incapable of learning anything in 4 years. Well, she's a better candidate now, for a host of reasons.
Yeah. I always preferred working for candidates who had lost because they knew what it was like and they wanted to avoid it. And they didn't think that they were bulletproof and, nothing bad could happen to them or they could talk their way out of anything. A lot of people run for president, very few people win. So losing a primary is in a race for president is no shame. We talk about in world affairs that you can win a war and lose the peace, or you can lose a war and win the peace. I think that I would say she ran a very successful campaign when she ran for president, because she ended up vice president. And that's the next best thing to being president. So if you go back to that debate stage, there was a lot of talent on that stage. And she was the pick to be vice president. And I think, as a candidate, as a vice president, as a candidate, there's three big moments. There's a moment you're picked. So you don't want to blow it like Dan Quayle when they picked him off Bourbon Street. Remember, he had like a drink in his hand. He's like, what, me? Yeah, I'll do it. And J.D. Vance, I think, had some of that. I think he failed that moment. And then you have your convention speech, and then you have a debate. And other than that, no one really pays attention to vice presidents or candidates for the most part. And if you can execute all three of those well, you have done your job. You have contributed what you can contribute to the campaign. And I think in 20, she did all three very well. And
her boss won, let's remember.
Yep. And, I don't think the Biden campaign gets enough credit for the brilliant campaign they ran in 20. Defeating an incumbent president is very difficult. And not to get too much in the weeds, but, after Watergate, we went to federal funding for general election presidential, which meant both candidates got the same amount of money. I mean, literally, when you walked off the stage after accepting the nomination, there's someone there from the Treasury Department, and they had a check for you. It would always go up with inflation and the country getting bigger. But it was around $81 million. And in campaigns, we'd always go like, can you wire this? And they're like, no, we deal checks. But under that, Carter lost and Bush lost, because it did level the playing field. So Obama rejected public funding in 2008. McCain stayed in. Obama spent $375 million. He had so much money that he had $35 million cash on hand on election day. John McCain spent $82 million. So then Romney-Obama was the first time since Nixon-McGovern that you had two candidates running against each other who were not in the federal funding system. And they both raised over $1 billion. And incumbent president won. Come along Biden, second time this has happened. And the incumbent president lost. So I think it's fair to ask, when's the last time an incumbent president lost who wasn't in the federal funding system? And the answer is Herbert Hoover. And he had a bad year. So I think what the Biden campaign did was very impressive. And I think you're seeing that same operation now. And it's a very, very impressive political organization.
In a raft of new polls, including 3-day and 5-day polls that were completely out of the Biden still candidate range, we're starting to see the shape of the race emerge. Harris has pulled ahead of Trump in many battleground states. It looks like overall she has a national lead of 2 to 3 points. Let's game this out from someone who knows, as you do, the dark arts. How do you sit on a lead, and how do you erase somebody else's lead? What would you be advising the two campaigns, given the way Harris is likely to come out of the convention on the 22nd?
Well, I mean, I think that you have to make this constantly a contrast. You have to remind people of the negatives of Trump, which is very easy to do. And I think if you just look at social media, there is a very different tone coming out of the Harris campaign than came out of the Biden campaign. And part of this, I think, they're very different individuals, different generations in a way, almost a generation. But also, there is something about being president, I think, that certainly with President Biden, he felt it had a certain dignity to it that affected his entire campaign. And some of the stuff that on social media that really works, I think he thought was probably off tonally, didn't reflect the way he would do it. Now, with Harris, you don't have that, and she's really unleashed. And they're out there kind of doing more like what we do in the Lincoln Project. They're taunting Trump. And Trump is the dog that will chase every car. He is the most predictable human on the planet. And you know, in the Lincoln Project, we have this sort of game we play where we make these spots called Audience of One, which is someone talking to Donald Trump like internal monologue. And then we place it where we know he'll see it on television, which is usually the Golf Channel. The Lincoln Project is a big buyer of the Golf Channel. And we buy it wherever he is, like in Mar-a-Lago or up in Bedminster, wherever. And it drives him absolutely crazy. And we have, as you would say, sources inside the Trump campaign. And, you know, they report, I saw this at 2 o'clock in the morning. How can this happen? And then he'll post about it. So I think there's a kind of gleeful embrace of the battle that you're seeing in the whole campaign structure of the Harris campaign. For Trump, God forbid I would give them advice. But what's fascinating here is, I mean, I think you could write a dissertation. I imagine dissertations will be written. If you take the prepared text of his acceptance speech and compare it to the speech he gave, I mean, that's just fascinating. Because the people running the Trump campaign, I know them well, worked with them. I wouldn't call them rock stars, but they're very competent. So they crafted a speech that they knew that Trump needed to give to get more votes or in the get more vote business. That's what they do. And Trump couldn't stay on that speech for 10 minutes and went off in this long Castro-like lengthy speech of grievances. So, you know, the problem that Trump has is that he can't change. I mean, I would say, look, ask any woman who had a friend who was going to marry a 79-year-old guy. And she said, well, there's a lot of things I don't like, but he says he's going to change. What would your advice be to your friend? It would probably be, you better like what you're getting because this guy ain't going to change because 79-year-old men do not change. And that is very much Donald Trump.
There are things that he's doing and saying that I think are unusual even for him. At one point,
the guy is degrading. I think he's degrading mentally, emotionally. You know, there is a phenomenon I've seen in campaigns where candidates, if they're at a point where they think they've won and then it gets pulled back, that's a very difficult moment for a lot of candidates. It takes a lot of emotional maturity to deal with that, to reset, to readjust. It's like, you know, someone says, go run 10 miles, fine, you run 10 miles. Then at the end, they say, no, actually, we're going to run another 10. That's a lot harder than if you said, we're going to run 20 miles from the beginning. And, you know, Trump, they clearly thought they had won this thing. And that's why he keeps, I mean, to the extent there's any logic to it, you know, posting this crazy stuff like Biden's going to really reemerge, or this is unfair, or this is illegal.
No, but Stuart, let me push back a little bit, because there is Donald Trump, and yes, he's a notoriously undisciplined campaigner. He's hard to control, impulsive, all of that. That's known to be true, and it's said even by people who are his closest confidants. But there's also a very large, sprawling Republican national structure, 50 state chairmen, party regulars, office holders, money bundlers. There's a big army out there. And they have just looked on as their candidate was ahead in every single poll, survived an assassination attempt, had a fairly orderly convention, and got nothing, unusually nothing, like moved backwards. At that point, people who want to win, people who see their own futures as threatened by this series of events, start to call and say, hey, let's change direction, let's change some things, let's change the commercials. I'm sure there's no shortage of, Las Savita's getting no shortage of advice right now, but yes, he is the candidate, but he's not the only one who's involved, and he's not the only one who's on the line here.
I think it's very. There's never been what has happened to the Republican Party has never happened to a party in American history. I think the party has completely collapsed as any sort of moral voice. I'll give you a perfect example. You know, there are these Republican governors out there who are very popular. Well, like Charlie Baker was in Massachusetts, Larry Hogan, Maryland. These are. I work for these guys. But here's the thing. As popular as they are, they can't pick their own state party chairman. That's how out of touch they are with the party. And there is no Republican National Committee now. It's just a function of the Trump family. I mean, from the very beginning, I think to a lot of us, the Trump campaign looked like a large criminal enterprise. And that has only gotten more so. So they have devastated the RNC structure and moved in. And that's very difficult to recover from. But I think, you know, there's a fascinating thing that's happening out there that doesn't get talked about enough. If you look at like tight Senate races and stuff, and you look at the ads that Republicans are running, I think it's a true statement. I don't know any Republican that is running an ad that talks about an achievement in Congress, something that was passed, that they actually voted for. They're out there running all these ads about the infrastructure bill they voted against. J.D. Vance, when he was asked what his greatest achievement as senator was, cited some Great Lakes cleanup thing that he voted against. And that's because they never, and when they had power, at least the House, they did nothing. They had no positive agenda. It goes back to, it's a reflection. And so when they had a chance to do something like on the border, Trump killed it. I mean, that's extraordinary. So I think it is I think it impacts the party completely. The party just has no idea what to do. Post-Dobbs, they have a problem with women, period. So what do? They attack Taylor Swift. Like, well, that's smart. That's really smart. And I just don't think that they have a language, and a lot of politics is language, to process this moment and to process where they are. And I think, I'm of the opinion I don't think the race is going to be particularly close.
I go back and forth on that question because I think there are still a very large number of people who are not reconciled to the idea of a woman president.
Yep.
Who are not reconciled to the idea of a non-white president.
Yep.
And if you ask them straight up, they might not cop to either of those things. They might not honestly answer, but they might say something like, the sight of a woman who wants to be the leader of the free world in black Converse and tight jeans, dancing with sorority women, I don't think that's dignified. I don't really like that. And hugging Beyonce, and they'll give various examples, which to them sound like other reasons. To me, sound like them still not being able to accept the idea of a woman or a black woman being president of the United States. But I think it would be a mistake to undercount those people.
Yeah. No, look, when I worked in presidential campaigns and people would say, "Are you worried about?" I would just stop them there and I would say, "Yes, whatever you're going to say, I'm worried about," because that's what we should do. The great white hope of the Trump campaign, which is white hope, is if you look at 2016, Trump was losing college-educated Republicans right up until the Comey letter. And then just enough of them came over. Biden brought them back, brought more college-educated Republicans and more white voters back, enough to win. And so the case for the Trump campaign, I mean, if you stuck me in front of the Oxford Union and made me resolve Donald Trump is going to win the 2024 election, it would be based upon exactly what you're saying, that in these states, there are enough white voters who will revert to a 16 pattern. I don't think that's going to happen, and I think it's going to be counterbalanced by the infusion and excitement of younger voters. I mean, it's a remarkable thing, but in 20, Biden's best group are under 30 voters. Remarkable in that, he was an old guy. He won them by 12 points. And, this is what we're focused on in the Lincoln Project. We've spent the last 2 years studying these voters, working with another independent group, Lincoln Democracy Institute. And we're focused on Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Arizona. And we have identified about 650,000 voters collectively in those states that arguably will decide this race. And we divide them into two categories. A category we call Dobbs, dads, and moms, which are those who are about 45 to 50% would say that they're anti-abortion, and yet they're appalled at what has happened post-Dobbs. They have a disproportionate number of them have daughters. And, all the years that Republicans ran against Obamacare, and I was part of that, what was our argument? Our argument was you don't want the government to come between you and your doctor. And that resonated with a lot of these people. So what in the world is post-Dobbs but exactly that? The government is coming between you and your doctor. So the same thing that bothered them in theory about Obamacare bothers them about post-Dobbs. And in every election, we have seen this impact more than we thought possible, or no one anticipated. And then there's another group that we call Red Dawn conservatives, from the old John Milius film, Red Dawn, about a high school, Russians invading the United States in a high school in Colorado that fought them. And these are a lot of Reagan voters who came to the party when they're older. And there's a lot about Trump they like, but the idea that Donald Trump would support Putin, the idea that the United States would not stand with Ukraine, is so unfathomable to them and repugnant to them that it's like this giant speed bump to get to Trump. I mean, these are people who believe that the party was defined by Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And I was one of those. And, I don't think we talk about this enough. Russians wanted Donald Trump to win. Donald Trump won. They helped him win. What did they get? Unfathomable amount of reward. What used to be the most consistent anti-Soviet Union, anti-Russian, strong on Russia group of American politics, the conservative element of the Republican Party, that is now the base of the pro-Putin movement in American politics. I mean, just think about it. It's as if the Germans had some covert operation that converted Churchill's party to being pro-Nazi. And yet it's true. And if Donald Trump wins, it's very difficult to imagine Ukraine not losing. And those are very powerful arguments to these people.
And possibly NATO unraveling. But I still want to insist on the residual strength of the Republican Party in this country. Joe Biden wouldn't have accomplished a thing, and there wouldn't have been a record for Democrats to run on in 2024 had the Republican Party nominated just normal, plausible candidates to various key offices. Herschel Walker in Georgia, the woman who had to deny she was a witch in Delaware, Todd Akin in Missouri, Richard Murdoch in Indiana. There is a long list. And this year, Mark Robinson in North Carolina, they say crazy things that plot well off of the midpoint of national life. And those were, again and again, Blake Masters in Arizona, winnable races that would have had a 52-48 or 53-47 Senate for the Republicans, and Nancy Pelosi never would have been Speaker of the House. Everybody was raving about Josh Shapiro this year. He wouldn't have been governor of Pennsylvania had they not nominated Doug Mastriano to be governor of Pennsylvania. So a lot of this goes down to a party that's kind of high on its own supply, or seems to have an unusual death wish.
Let me pose another theory, and that is they're getting what they want. There is free will here. Every chance the Republican Party has to reject Trump, they've run closer to him. He's now this is the third time he's been the nominee of the party. All those candidates you named, they won primaries against people who were not crazy. And this is why I go back to, I think the only intellectually honest conclusion for those of us who worked in the party and are appalled by what has happened is that Trump didn't change the party, he revealed the party. Because people don't abandon deeply held beliefs in a few years. And it just meant that all the stuff that we said and we held out as values, character counts, they were just marketing slogans and didn't mean anything. So you end up with J.D. Vance, who's the most accidental figure, I mean, in American political history, probably. It's extraordinary. I mean, Peter Thiel hadn't put $15 million in that primary at the very end. He never would have won.
So, if the Democratic Party had put any money into Murphy, J.D. Vance might have lost. He won by 2.5 points. He didn't win running away.
He underperformed the top of the ticket by 400,000 votes, which is pretty amazing. But look at what happened in this Republican primary for president. So there were alternatives to Trump. Now, 2 of them, I think, are fair to say, were anti-Trump candidates. Chris Christie, and governor of Arkansas, both of whom were clients of mine, had been clients of mine. And then what happened? They got cumulatively 10%. And then it gets narrowed down to Nikki Haley. Now, to me, Nikki Haley lost any chance she had to be taken seriously. Well, I think she lost any chance she had to be taken seriously when she went to work in the Trump administration. But in this race, when she raised her hand and said you would support Donald Trump, he was convicted of a felony. So you got to say she held true to her word. Donald Trump got convicted of a felony. Nikki Haley endorsed him. And yet when Nikki Haley was running against Trump, she couldn't get more than, 10, 15%. There's not a market for it. This isn't what Republicans want. So, you look at sort of so-called good Republicans like Glenn Youngkin, guy who was elected governor of Virginia. Now, there was a time not that long ago when Glenn Youngkin, I would have thought was a great client, had a lot of money, seems like a good guy, smart. He gets elected governor. What happens? He ends up going to Arizona and campaigning for Kari Lake, election denier. He didn't change the party. Kari Lake changed him. So there is, and look, I mean, I just, I never would have. This is a party that doesn't have room for a Cheney. A Cheney. And any element that opposed this has either been defeated or marginalized to a point where it doesn't matter. So I think we have to give we can't infantilize the Republican Party and think, well, just these things are happening to them. This is an active choice of the Republican Party. They have gone down this dark, racially divisive, angry road, joined hands and gone down there willingly. And I think they're going to reap what they sowed.
We have a lot of great questions from the audience. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible. During 2020, Biden was able to appeal to moderate Republicans, like the demographic behind the Lincoln Project. Can Harris keep those voters?
You know, if you know the answer to that question, you'll know who's going to win this race. It's a fantastic question. It's the essential question of the race. Trump has to get north of 58% of the white vote, probably closer to 60%. And, you know, just a stat that always blows my mind that shows how America's changed. So 1980, Ronald Reagan wins this sweeping landslide, 44 states, I think, right? He got 55% of the white vote. You go to 2008, McCain loses a not particularly close race to Obama with 58% of the white vote. And that's kind of everything you need to know about American politics and the way it's changing. In 1964, Goldwater got 7% of the black vote. 2020, Trump got 8%. That's 1 point every 56 years. It's going to take a while, guys. I think that the choice of her running mate probably played into that demographic. But I think the ugliness of Trump was repugnant to people, that group in 20, and I think that it's going to be just as repugnant, and maybe more so now.
If you were Kamala Harris's debate coach, how would you advise her to debate Trump, which looks like it might happen on September 10th? They've both agreed to it.
You know, I have done a lot of presidential debate preps. I have very fixed ideas about how to debate prep. I think the key is you have to go in with a strategy and try to accomplish 2 to 4 things, not more, and know how you're going to make those moments happen. And usually the most aggressive candidate wins a debate. So very, very simple debate prep for Vice President Harris. You're a prosecutor. Look what you did to Kavanaugh. Go out on that stage with the mentality, one of us is going to walk off alive and attack Donald Trump and prosecute him. He is a criminal. And I think that's what she'll do, because usually candidates like to do what they're good at, and she's really good at that.
I understand your answer entirely. I'm wondering if it's more complicated than that simple, straightforward answer for a woman doing that to a man when there's 2 of them on stage, and for a non-white woman doing that to a white man when there's 2 of them on stage.
I would say yes, and I would say there's nothing you can do about it, and
True
not
enough.
to think about it.
But you'd stick with the aggression.
Go ahead. No.
But you'd stick with the aggression advice.
100%.
Okay. If the Republicans lose the presidency, the House and the Senate, will the party finally abandon MAGA?
No. Trumpism is the Republican Party now. I think that the best hope is 2032. No one is going to get nominated in 28 if Trump loses, who will assert aggressively that Donald Trump lost a free and fair election in 20 and 24. You won't. And the party is, it's really become, I think, an extremist movement, not a classic American political party. So I think it's better to compare it to like the Red Guard. So there wasn't like a moderate element in the Red Guard that emerged that finally like ended the Red Guard. They just had to play itself out. And I think that that's going to happen here. Republicans are going to have to be defeated again and again and again. And then eventually we need a center-right party that's sane in America. But there is no conservative governing philosophy in America now that anybody can articulate with credibility. What is it? I mean, if you held a gun to my head, I'd say, shoot, I don't have any idea. And I worked in the party 30 years. So, I think that they're going to have to rebuild, but pain is the only teacher in politics. And it's going to take them a long time to adjust. And then hopefully something better will emerge.
Well, apparently you think winning the popular vote once in 40 years is not enough pain for them to learn the lesson yet.
I worked for Bush in 2000. We would joke sort of like, anybody can get elected president when you get more votes. It's when you lose by 500,000 it takes professionals, which we thought was kind of funny. Not so funny. And I would abolish the Electoral College tomorrow if I could. I think it'd be the best thing that would happen to the Republican Party because the party would be forced to appeal to more people. But this specter of minority rule is extraordinarily disturbing in America. So, I mean, if you look at the Supreme Court, in the history of America, there are 5 Supreme Court justices who confirmed by senators who represented less than a majority of the country. All 5 are on the court right now. And you have a race where somebody loses 3 million votes but still gets elected president. How long can you sustain that? I think it's very difficult.
Foreign policy rarely affects U.S. elections. Do you think the conflict in Gaza, war in Ukraine, and rising tensions with China will have an impact on voters? If so, how should candidates handle these issues in the campaign?
Yeah, it's a great question. Abdo's, I think, the one that is obviously the most volatile, I think it's obvious, is Israel and Gaza. I don't think it's going to be decisive, though. I think that those who are most motivated by this, majority of them, not all, of course, have given permission to the vice president to find her own way here and separate some from the Biden administration.
It's a subtle thing, though, because daylight is one thing, too much daylight is another thing.
It's very, very difficult. There is an element out there of, I was talking about, where the Ukraine war to these voters is important. And I think there's something amazing. It seems to be happening out there, and that is, for generations, the Republican Party was seen as the party of strength on foreign policy. That's changing. So who goes to Taiwan? Nancy Pelosi. Who goes to Kyiv? The only American president to go in an active war zone that we didn't control. To stand with a president who is fighting against a dictator in a war of genocide. And Republicans are opposed to it. Not all of them, thank God, but still. And I if that can continue, it will reshape American politics in ways that are difficult to imagine.
The polling on J.D. Vance seems to be pretty weak, and right out of the box, people seem to like Tim Walz. But just as Republicans are sort of grappling with how to run against Kamala Harris, they've been looking for ways, avenues of attack on Tim Walz, questioning his military record, Marco Rubio tweeted out the other day that the Chinese communist leadership had groomed Tim Walz for leadership in the United States, which is the kind of thing that when I was a kid, the Birchers might say.
Yeah, exactly.
But this was a United States senator saying it about the Democratic Party nominee for vice president. They had been groomed by the Chinese communist leadership to be a leader in the United States. I wonder what difference, will it make a difference, who the vice presidential candidates are in the final analysis?
It's a mistake to attack any vice presidential candidate, because people have proven over and over again they're willing to believe a vice president is a moron and still vote for the president. They just don't care. There's no race in American history where you can say the vice presidential race played a difference. I mean, go back to Roosevelt. He jumps Wallace, he picks Truman because he needed someone more conservative. Well, did that impact the race? It's hard to look at any state that they won because of Truman. It doesn't matter. Any day you're attacking a vice president is a good day for the presidential candidate on that ticket.
So therefore, Democrats shouldn't spend much time on J.D. Vance then?
I think that what Vance is a way to talk about a attitude of the party in a lot of ways. J.D. Vance is someone who has said that women should stay in violent marriages. He's someone who has said even if women are raped and are pregnant, as regrettable as that might be, they still should be forced to have that child. So he's referred to rape as regrettable. That, I think, is, you're not really talking about J.D. Vance per se. You know, no one's talking about J.D. Vance's vote or what J.D. Vance did. It's just a way that shows another way to talk about Trump's misogyny and Trump's lack of respect for women, Trump's extremism on abortion. And people just don't like J.D. Vance. He's a weird, damaged guy. And angry at the world. And usually running for office is not the great way to work through your personal problems as therapy.
Interestingly, and this is a modern phenomenon, J.D. Vance, just turned 40, seems scarcely to have had a thought in the last dozen years that he didn't say into a camera or a microphone or a keyboard. And he's what we would call now in 2024 very online. Is that something that the vetting team missed? Is there a warning in that for future politicians that you don't show all your underwear?
Yeah. You'd have to be inside that campaign to know. I mean, I've been part of campaigns that vetted people, and it's an exhaustive process, like you say, usually very methodical. From what I read, and I only know what I read, same thing everybody else has read publicly, you know, picking J.D. Vance seemed to be a last-minute decision that was greatly influenced by, you know, such great strategists as Don Jr. and Elon Musk. I mean, this is one of the great, hilarious things of American politics. Elon Musk said to Trump he'd give him $45 million a month, you know, and wanted him to pick J.D. Vance, and pick J.D. Vance, and Elon Musk go, thanks. I don't know about the $45 million. I don't really think that's going to happen. So I suspect that a lot of this stuff was in a vetting review of Vance. And I bet Trump didn't read a word of it.
And finally, I think a good question for us to go out on, if Kamala Harris wins the presidency, what would be next for the Lincoln Project?
You know, we've talked about that, and this isn't a place to announce that. I think that there still is a fight against Trumpism in American politics that is really going to be critical. That's a lot easier fight, more of a downhill fight if the vice president wins, because that will be a transformative moment in American politics. But Trumpism is evil, and you have to fight Trumpism. And I think that there is a lot that we've learned that the right has done in creating media ecospheres that the center-left hasn't done. I mean, if you look at Prager University on the right, I mean, there are a lot of, it's not Fox News. This is a myth. I mean, more than 3 million people never watch Fox News. There's like 320 million Americans. It's much deeper, and it's much more institutionalized. And there's a long history of this that goes to the history of right-wing media in America, which is kind of fascinating. There's an unbelievably great and interesting book called Messengers on the Right that was written by this University of Virginia professor analyzing how the whole right-wing movement post-World War II emerged, media movement. So there'll definitely, I think, be a role for the Lincoln Project.
We're just not going to find out what it is tonight. Stuart Stevens, thanks a lot. Please thank Stuart Stevens for joining us. If you would like to engage in future programs or support Commonwealth Club World Affairs, to visit our website at www.commonwealthclub.org. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again online and here in the flesh on the Embarcadero. Great to see you all.